Hello. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about macroeconomics again, and the particular topic of the day is talking about the business cycle and what the government can do about fixing the business cycle and what the private sector can do about fixing the business cycle. To get at that notion, we first of all have to build this idea of the business cycle. And what is that? Well, a business cycle is these erratic ebbs and flows in economic activity that occur in capitalistic economies. They occur in socialist economies as well, but the socialists generally don't keep the same good records that the capitalist economies do. And the former Soviet Union, for example, claimed that it didn't have a business cycle, but most Western economists thought that it really did. But in any event, the ebbs and flows of the economy mean that things get good and then they turn around and get bad. And we sort of know what that feels like. When things are good, there's a lot of building going on, there's economic growth going on. It might be relatively easier to find a job and to keep a job. And conversely, when things are bad, there's less building going on, less home construction. We know that there's less travel going on, people are losing their jobs, businesses are closing, and it creates havoc and unemployment for people. So those are ebbs and flows, and we know that there's been some serious ebbs and flows in the last 100 years. We can think of the Great Depression from 1929 to approximately 1939 or so, where economic activity ground almost to a halt. The unemployment rate then was 25%, and there was a lot of dislocation, a lot of foreclosures of businesses and farms and so forth. And that was just a very bleak time in U.S. economic history. Similarly, in the recent past, in 2007, 2008, 2009, there was another major recession. We call it the Great Recession because it was really the worst downturn since the Great Depression. And again, there was a lot of problems, particularly in the housing sector, a long bout of unemployment, and it's taken us several years to get out of that tailspin. So the ebbs and flows are called the business cycle, and it's not a regular cycle. It's in fact quite an irregular cycle. It goes up for sometimes 3, 5, 7 years in a row, and then it dips down. It might dip down for 6 months. It might dip down for a year or two, and those up and down dips are what we call the business cycle. Now, how do we measure that? Well, there's a couple ways we can measure it. The most common way that we measure it is by the gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is the market value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. And currently in the U.S., that number is about $15 trillion. It's an enormous, it's $17 trillion these days. It's an enormously big economy, the biggest economy in the world. And if you divide that up by the 315 million people in the country, you end up with a number of about 45,000. And that's the share per person of GDP in this country. So that's a high level of income, that's a high level of output, and it's a big economy that this place is involved in. So the thing bounces around from time to time. And what causes those bounces? Well, unfortunately, economists don't really know. We've identified a bunch of things that are associated with economic recession. One of those is just a fall in consumer confidence. Sometimes consumers collectively, they get nervous. They decide that they can't afford a new car, they can't afford a second home, or they can't afford to add on to the home. They can't afford to go out to eat. And all of those things are consumer confidence issues. And if they all gang up on us at the same time, then collectively we can have a downturn in spending. Obviously, if consumers stop buying, then producers don't have as much demand for their product, and they start laying off workers and canceling orders and doing other things like that that slow down the economy. So consumer crisis of confidence is a big explanatory idea behind the business cycle. We also know there's a lot of shocks in the economy, and economists like that word shock. And what that means is there's a surprise that business people and consumers didn't anticipate. Oftentimes, these are natural resource shocks, and one of the big ones in the last 25 years has been oil shocks, where the foreign countries, for example, the OPEC countries, might decide they don't want to sell us oil at the price that it's been selling at. They might want to raise that price considerably, like they did in the early 70s. And we're a heavily oil-based economy or an oil-dependent economy. And when the price of oil goes up, then transportation's affected, car ownership is affected, all kinds of shipping and all kinds of production is affected by that, and it puts a shock into the economy that the economy has to respond to. There's other shocks, of course. There's shocks from wars, there's shocks from natural disasters. Think back to Hurricane Katrina 5 or 6 years ago. In that event, actually, Katrina was a bit farther back than that. I think that was in 2005, but whatever. It was a while back, and some of us can remember that. In any event, those kind of things put a ripple through the economy. There's a lot of destruction. There's a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done. People moving around and other kind of responses to natural disasters. And similarly, wars, dislocations from World War II and from the Vietnam conflict and others through time. All of those get the economy, disrupt the economy, and the economy then has to react. Well, how does the economy react to these outside influences? There's a couple of big schools of thought that we'll consider in the textbook and in the course of the class. The first one is the classical response. And the classical economists, basically from 1800 to 1935 or so, considered that the economy had a lot of self-resilience. In other words, it was going to be able to heal itself fairly well. And so the classical school, which relied on a dictum called Say's Law, he was a French economist that wrote in the early 1800s, basically said that if prices were flexible, and we economists believe that they were flexible, when we had flexible prices, the labor market would take care of these imperfections, and the price system would get the economy going again. And basically what that means is if there was an oil shock, for example, and oil prices went up real fast, then people would stop buying oil intensive products, and they'd start buying other things that didn't require so much oil. And with that, among other adjustments that people made, eventually the price system would take care of these imbalances. Wages would fall in many cases in the labor market, and ultimately the economy would sort of right itself. John Maynard Keynes, who was the famous British economist that wrote during the Great Depression, said that was not really how it worked. He said that prices did not behave so flexibly, and in fact he called them sticky prices. And sticky prices mean that they don't correct very easily, labor markets don't adjust, and instead of people getting a reduction in their wage, rather they got laid off or furloughed. And so that put people out of work, and when they didn't have work, they couldn't spend, and the recession was aggravated by the fact that the labor market didn't respond very well to changes in prices. So as we're going forward here, we're going to talk a lot about that business cycle idea. We're going to talk about how the classic idea was modified through the Keynesian interpretation of the business cycle, and we'll get a better feel for how policymakers in the U.S. can do something about the business cycle and reduce its ill effects. So that's to come in the next couple of weeks.